Hello friends, for today's video I wanted to go through a list of some adult fantasy works that on surface level maybe don't sound as exciting or maybe as interesting, but in actuality they're a lot slower going because they're more immersive, they're more focused on developing the characters, character relationships, building a foundation for a really epic world, those sorts of things. And I know for a lot of us, those are the kinds of works we're looking for, those are the kinds of stories that we can really get lost in, and so I wanted to highlight some books that I think do that really well. There is going to be a companion video to this where I talk about really fast-paced, action-packed fantasy, in case that's more so what you're looking for. I think both have phenomenal pacing, it's just that the pacing is different and it can be appealing to different kinds of readers, and it can be appealing to the same reader just at different points in their reading. But anyway, starting today with the slower paced ones, the first few that I'm going to mention are actually somewhat related in a lot of ways. So we have the Farseer trilogy by Robin Hobb, and then also Live Ships as well. Another series that sounds almost identical in its setup to Farseer, but actually is quite different, and that would be The Age of Assassins. And then another work that in general I just feel like influenced a lot of modern fantasy, including Robin Hobb, and that would be the Eros trilogy by Mercedes Lackey. So I'm actually going to start with this one because it is the oldest, not just of these three, but of all the ones that I'm going to talk about. So it follows a young girl whose name is Talia, and at the beginning of the story, when you first meet her, it is very clear that her family, they live in this rather rural area, her family is quite abusive to her, and her only future really is in marrying somebody likely much older than her. She's quite young herself, and so she's not really looking forward to this, but this is all that she knows. It's what happens to every sibling of hers. It's clear that she has been mistreated in her life thus far, but then there is this magical horse that arrives, and it determines that she is destined for something greater. And so she goes with this horse to this basically magic school, and it sounds like a coming-of-age story. It sounds like it would be very sweet, and the first one of the trilogy is incredibly sweet. I would actually describe the first one as being quite cozy, and you really just follow Talia as she is learning her worth. And so when it comes to coming-of-age stories, I think this one does it exceptionally well. That first book, you could read it on its own, even though there's clearly some things left unanswered, but that first book is just so sweet, and it's also quite heartbreaking to see a child who has been so harmed in the past trying to learn that they matter and trying to recognize that it's okay to trust people, especially trusting adults. And then the story kind of builds from there as Talia grows up. The first one in the trilogy was my favorite. It was one of my favorite things that I've read in 2023, and it's what's made me really excited to read more Mercedes Lackey, more of Valdemar, and the way that the animals have connections to the humans, the way that the magic works, how some of it feels much more magical, doesn't really feel like rules and limitations, is some of where I see the comparisons between this and Hobb, but then also just in its pacing and in the way you follow Talia as she grows up, similar to how you follow Fitz as he grows up. I actually found that this was more to my liking than Farseer because Fitz is not my favorite character actually, but I know for a lot of people they really love his arc, they really love the exploration of depression, and when you feel like you have no agency in your own life, a lot of people really like to see that depicted in a story, even though it would sound really tragic. That's sometimes sort of cathartic to see, especially when you're feeling that in your own life. So definitely, if either of these sound like your cup of tea, I would highly recommend both, and I would recommend maybe trying to read them around the same time so that you can see some of those parallels and maybe where there was some inspiration, or at the very least where Mercedes Lackey has contributed to a lot of what we see in fantasy now. I mentioned the Live Ship traders as well, which in my opinion is quite different from Farseer. So if you've ever been nervous to pick up Hobb, or maybe you picked up Farseer but you've been hesitant to pick up Live Ships because you didn't really like Farseer, I think they are quite different, especially because Farseer is more zeroed in on one character, whereas Live Ship feels much more epic, and also the world itself, the exploration of the world, and the exploration of the family dynamics and the familial drama is great in the Live Ship traders. I didn't end up loving the end of the trilogy, but I still recommend it as a whole because I think that Hobb's writing is fantastic in that series, and it doesn't really feel like it has much of a plot other than Althea really wants to prove herself. Also, it seems like maybe trade is being disrupted for her family, where they live, but there's not like a set, here's the bad guy, we're going to take this person out sort of setup. So it feels a little meandering, but it's definitely what I was describing before, a world that you can just very much get lost in. And if you do like both Farseer and Live Ships, then you're set, because the Realm of the Elderlings has so many books in it. So you have a huge world to explore from there. I mentioned Age of Assassins because it sounds like Farseer in that you follow a young man who is an apprentice to an assassin, which is similar to Fitz. And this character, I would say the mentor-mentee relationship is much stronger for them than it is for Fitz. And I really liked their relationship. In fact, it's one of my favorites. And I did a whole video actually about some great mentor-mentee relationships as a result of this book, because I loved the relationship between these two characters so much. But it also is a little bit more of a coming-of-age story. You follow him following his mentor, who is an assassin, who is trying to hunt another assassin. And it seems like with that synopsis that would be very action-packed, but it's not. It's quite slow going, but I really liked our main character, and as I said multiple times at this point, I really liked the relationship between him and his mentor. After that, we have Anthony Ryan. So I've read Bloodsong by Anthony Ryan, as well as The Pariah. Both, I think, are kind of slower going. I loved Bloodsong. I loved Valen. You follow him from the time that he is a boy, and you watch him grow into a man, and you are following him specifically going to this very elite school that is training the best of the best soldiers. And it doesn't seem like there would be a whole lot there that would be all that interesting, but the character relationship building, watching not just Valen grow, but the other boys at this school, looking at the hardships that they have to face, what they have to overcome, and then also getting to know their pasts, their backgrounds, their families, and then finding out how some of their families are connected, and then seeing the way that when they're young, what seem like small differences become enormous, and you have to see whether or not they can overcome those things. They end up working for various different people that might not put them on the same side as each other. There's just so much to it that you are so captivated by, or at least I was. And for me, as far as the whole I'm going to tell you my life story type of book, this one I think is masterful at it. I can be quite picky with that setup because it can be a little bit dull, and because it feels like it ruins the suspense. It feels like it ruins the stakes, because you're like, well, you're telling me your story now, so at the very least I know you live. But it if anything added to the suspense, because you're like, but how did you get to this point? How could that have possibly happened with where you started? So I actually think it enhanced the reading experience. The Pariah is a little different. I would say it's a much more rough around the edges main character, and you're following them as they have had life not deal them a very good hand, and they are finding themselves caught up in a gang, essentially, and this gang runs this area within the forest. If you pay them, if you have a good relationship, a good standing with them, they will protect you as you traverse this area. But if you try to attack them, if you try to get in their way, and if you betray them, then they are going to come after you. So our main character has had to do some things he probably doesn't really want to have to do, but he does whatever he can because this is the only family he's ever known, the only protection he's ever known. And then things get kind of turned on their head when the gang, through some circumstances outside their control, or maybe as a result of some things they tried to control, it disperses, and then suddenly our main character doesn't really know what is going to come of his life, and he sort of just finds himself being pulled in all these different directions by all of these powerful different people. I actually think if you like Robin Hobb and you like watching Fitz sort of have this attachment to these various different people in power, then you might actually quite like The Pariah. I would say The Pariah would be better suited for Hobb fans than Bloodsong, but I still really like Bloodsong. After that, we have Spinning Silver by Naomi Novik. This is one of my favorite fantasy standalones. I think the combination of historical and fantasy is fantastic. And you follow this young woman who is Jewish. Her family, her father specifically, is a moneylender, but he is also not very good at his job. And part of the problem is that in this particular time that this story is taking place in, they are very mistrustful of Jewish people, and so the father feels like he cannot ask for what is owed to him because it will only cause resentment in other people. They'll start to fall back on stereotypes, and he's worried that it will put his family's safety in jeopardy. However, poverty is also putting their safety in jeopardy, and our main character Miriam is recognizing very quickly that if they do not get what is owed to them, then she will probably starve. Her mother is sick, she'll starve, and they will not make it. So she ends up kind of taking her father's job upon herself, and in building some interest on what is owed to them, this catches the attention of the Fae, who believe she is turning silver into gold. And so they now are finding themselves very captivated by her and wanting to make deals with her. And she doesn't really want anything to do with the Fae, but she sort of can't help but get caught up in it. She doesn't really have much of a choice. And within this story, you also have other characters' lives interwoven with Miriam's. And the way that domestic violence is explored in the story is done, it's hard to see, but it's done very well. And I always say that this story is kind of about the quiet ways that the characters find power and the quiet ways in which they find a sense of agency in their lives and what they're willing to do for themselves and for those they care about, not in the way of having these big epic battles and having a lot of magic, but pulling from their own strength and their own wit to help themselves and help other people. So I really liked this one. It's one of my favorites. Cannot recommend it enough. Love Spinning Silver. After that, we have The Weaver and the Witch Queen. And then also by the same author, we have Witch's Heart. If you like one, you're probably going to like the other as well. This one follows Angrboda, Loki's witch wife, who she does not want to lend her powers to Odin, but because she has certain powers, specifically the gift of foresight, Odin wants to take advantage of this power and use it for himself. So she is trying to live in isolation so that Odin cannot find her, and she ends up finding a companion in Loki. They become invested in each other's lives, and then you see the lengths at which she is willing to go to protect the people that she loves. I think as far as mythology, this is one of my favorites, and I think that this author pretty much now has been solidified as an auto-buy author for me, because I think that with the first one, I wasn't sure if it was just this particular story that she was retelling that I really liked, or if it was her writing, which I did like her writing and I could see that right away, but I wasn't sure with her next book what I was going to think. But then I ended up loving this one as well, The Weaver and the Witch Queen, and I think that she took a chance because one of them is much more mythology and one of them feels much more like if like you're hearing somebody tell a saga in Norway or in Iceland of these various people in history, and as they're telling this saga, it's as though magic truly existed, and so it feels very captivating, but it doesn't feel the same. And she mastered, I think, both of those different kinds of story. One feeling much more magical in nature and the other one feeling much more historical in nature. Both, I think, doing the original characters and stories justice. I just really, really like her writing. She very much seems knowledgeable about the stories that she is retelling or that she's doing some kind of twist on. And as a result, her decisions for every single thing that she keeps the same, everything that she changes, it seems like it's such a well-informed decision, and it's always for the betterment of the story itself. But regardless, if you don't know what The Weaver and the Witch Queen is about, you follow these three young women who are very good friends. And also, I just want to highlight the fact that it's really cool to see friendship as such a focus in the story. And their friendship is put to the test when one of them is captured and it would seem likely sold into slavery, and then the other two are doing everything they can to get her back. And their path leads them to some very powerful people, and you see what they are willing to do to get this other woman back and to free her from slavery. I thought both were very, very good. Definitely a little bit slower going, but I was very lost in the worlds for both of them. After that, we have Keikayi. So this one is also a little bit more mythology feeling. You follow a young woman who has certain powers associated with seeing threads between people, and you follow her from the time she's young, which is pretty common in a lot of these slower going, more character-driven stories, but you follow her as she grows into a woman, and she doesn't get a lot of say in her own life, but she does have some sense of authority, and she always is doing everything she can to try and make other people's lives better, make society better. And sometimes some of the things in which would be more progressive for her society also seem to go against tradition. And sometimes tradition is very much woven in with religion and faith. And she considers herself a faithful person, but when she is trying to strive for progress, a lot of these things she has to really question. And I thought the way the author did all of that was very, I thought it was exceptional. I think it's a hard thing to balance in a character, because usually I have found that characters just abandon tradition for a path forward, or they rely really heavily on just one of those elements and they abandon the others, whereas this one, she's really trying to find some balance between everything, but always thinking about others, whether that be her family, her friends, the individual people that she finds herself connected to, or sometimes complete strangers. She just always has a good heart. She's a flawed character, but I thought she was a very realistic character, and I really liked following her story. A couple of newer releases would be The Thorns Remain, as well as The Sword Defiant, and these are quite different from each other, but both I think are worth checking out. The Sword Defiant is definitely slower going, and it wouldn't seem like it based off the synopsis. So the setup is that you follow this man who was part of a group of people that basically defeated the Dark Lord. And now you are following him a few decades later. He's older, he's not as strong, he's not as fast, and he no longer has a purpose. And he doesn't really know what to make of that. This story falls back on a lot of the typical types of fantasy races and different groups of people and their lore and things like that. You see a lot of what's very familiar in fantasy within this story. So you have the dwarf who loves his axe, and you have the elven princess, and you have the Dark Lord, like I mentioned. And what I thought was interesting is this ended up playing really well into both paying respect to previous fantasy stories that have come before, while also sort of criticizing those stories for not really exploring what this sort of an epic tale, what this sort of hero's journey would do to a character after. What comes next? What about all the trauma that they took on during that journey? And that's really what you're exploring in this story. You follow this main character I mentioned, as well as his sister. You really don't see the two of them interact very much, so you're not sure how their paths are going to cross, but you assume that inevitably they will somehow. And I do think that the plot itself is a little meandering, and there are some interesting action sequences, but they're really not the focus of the story. I really think it's more about the exploration of the trauma, as well as just being really introspective with these main characters. The Thorns Remain, in my opinion, is one of the most underrated fantasy stories I've picked up. It does sound a bit like a lot of other fae stories that you hear about. You have this young woman who is living in this very rural area, very poor area, and her friends one day encounter the fae, and all of her friends are taken, and she manages to escape. And then when she returns to her village, nobody else realizes that something is amiss, as the fae have convinced them that all of these young people left months ago, and they've been gone for a very long time, and for no suspicious reasons. They all left because they're starting their lives. And our main character, Mora Jean, knows that this is not true, and there's only one other woman in the village who is able to get through the glamour and recognize that, no, this is definitely, there's something sinister going on, and so they work together to do what they can to free Mora Jean's friends from the fae. So at first it just seems like a typical fae story, but there are two things that I found to be the thematic emphasis in the story, and that would be recognizing manipulation and abuse within relationships, while also recognizing what your life is like after you have lost a loved one, and how that's tied into the story gets revealed the more of the story that you read. But you see that Mora Jean has had someone she cared very much about before the book even started. It would seem that that person has passed away, and you're discovering how that's affecting her and how that informs her decisions when it comes to everything she does, whether that be her day-to-day life, and then also how she tries to free her friends, and the desperation and the desire to do something but it's actually really tragic. I think you could read this story as just a girl trying to get her friends back from the Fae and leave it at that. And if that's all you're getting out of it, I can absolutely see why it would be boring, because the amount of day-to-day, look at it, Mora Jean's poor and she has lots of chores to do, and doesn't it suck being sick? And it's just a lot of that, and you're like, oh man, okay, but like, what about all the interesting stuff with the Fae? But to me, I really enjoyed that more historical feel. I thought it grounded the story. I thought it made everything more human in an otherwise very bizarre situation, and it does get very bizarre, especially toward the end of the story. But I think if you go into it kind of looking for those thematic pieces, that it's going to be a much more meaningful story. I really highly recommend this one, but I kind of have to recommend it with that little asterisk of, you might have to look for those things. And also, if you don't like it, that's completely fine and legitimate. I just think that I think it's very good. And there's some very great quotes that can be applied to a lot of things that a lot of people have experienced. The last one I'm going to recommend for today would be The Queens of Innis Lear. If you like beautiful writing, pick this one up. If you want to pick up a King Lear retelling, pick this one up. You follow these 3 women whose father, it would seem, is losing his sanity, and 2 of the women couldn't care less. They hate their father. They think he was responsible for their mother's death. The only reason they have any kind of relationship with him, or any kind of relationship with who he is because they're waiting for him to die so that they can have potentially his inheritance. However, there is one daughter, the 3rd sister, who does not believe that he was responsible for their mother's death. She does not care about the inheritance, but because she's the daughter that has remained and been there for him and helped him, it would seem like maybe she's going to end up getting a lot of not only his wealth, but a lot of his status and what comes with that, even though she doesn't want to be a part of that. So you're really just exploring the dynamics between this family, these sisters, their father. You're trying to piece together, did he have something to do with the mother's death, or was it an accident? The magic's really weird in this story. It's very much tied to the land. It's very abstract, and it's not at all a magic system, but that does make it feel much more magical. It really is quite slow. Even I like slow moving stories because I do like being immersed in a world, but this one took me so long to get through. But I do still think it's very powerful, and oh my gosh, the way that the father, him losing his mind, is really sad to watch. But then at the same time, there's that moral conundrum of you wondering like, well, but was he responsible for the mom's death? Because if he was, then I don't know how bad I feel actually. And you just don't know. So that's part of and that's part of everything that plays such a role in how all of the characters behave, how all of them behave toward one another. Anyway, if you are interested in beautiful writing and a King Lear retelling with a ton of familial drama, that's the book for you. But anyway, that's it for some more slow-going types of adult fantasy stories. If you have any of your own recommendations, of course, feel free to leave those in the comments down below. And then, like I said, there will be a companion video to this about some fast-paced, action-packed stories that you don't feel the need to sit in. You just want to go and you just want to move. But anyway, thanks so much for watching. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you later.